If this story resonates with you, don't just watch, share it. One person's story can ignite change, but only if brave voices like yours help spread the message. Hit subscribe now to join a community that stands against injustice. The Montana highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. Headlights from occasional passing cars swept across Maya Evans' face as she drove, the soft glow of her dashboard illuminating her tired eyes. It was just past midnight. The radio hummed quietly, some late-night podcast about cryptocurrency and AI innovation that she wasn't really listening to anymore. After 12 hours of driving, Maya just wanted to get to her hotel in Billings. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the steering wheel as she checked the GPS. 30 more minutes. Just 30 more minutes, and she could finally rest. Maya wasn't in her Air Force uniform tonight, just a simple gray hoodie and jeans, her curly hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked like any other traveler on the road. At least that's what she thought. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her heart sink. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, checking her speedometer. She'd been going exactly 5 over the limit, practically crawling by Montana standards. With a resigned sigh, Maya signaled and eased her Honda onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires. She put the car in park, killed the music, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Air Force training had drilled procedures into her for years. This was just another protocol to follow. The cruiser stopped behind her, headlights blazing, nearly blinding her through the mirrors. She squinted, watching as a figure emerged and took a deliberate, unhurried pace toward her car. The officer moved with an unmistakable swagger, the walk of someone who enjoyed making people wait. As he approached, Maya caught his reflection in her side mirror. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a tight crew cut and mirrored sunglasses despite the darkness. The nameplate on his uniform read, Reynolds. The sight of those glasses at midnight sent a warning signal through her brain. "License and registration," Officer Reynolds demanded, shining his flashlight directly into her eyes rather than at her hands or the dashboard. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man used to immediate compliance. Maya blinked against the harsh light. "Can you point that somewhere else, please?" she asked calmly, her voice level. The beam didn't move. "License and registration," he repeated, his tone hardening. Slowly telegraphing her movements, Maya reached toward the glove compartment. "I'm just getting my registration," she said clearly. She pulled out the documents and reached for her wallet. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Officer Reynolds took the papers but didn't answer immediately. He studied her license longer than necessary, then swept his flashlight through the interior of her car. "You were swerving," he finally said. Maya frowned. "I wasn't swerving, Officer Reynolds." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with tension. Reynolds leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with her window. Even in the darkness, she could sense his expression changing. "Are you calling me a liar, ma'am?" The ma'am came out like an insult. Maya took a measured breath. 7 years of military service had taught her how to handle moments like this. "No, sir. I'm just confused about the reason for the stop." Reynolds straightened up, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why?" Maya kept her voice steady, non-confrontational. "Because I said so." Reynolds' hand moved to rest on his holster, a subtle gesture that wasn't subtle at all. "Step out of the vehicle now." Maya felt her chest tighten. The situation was escalating for no reason, following a pattern she'd heard about too many times. She had rights, but exercising them at midnight on an empty highway might not be the safest choice. Still, she refused to be intimidated. "Officer Reynolds," she said firmly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I'd like to know the specific reason you're asking me to exit my vehicle." Reynolds' posture shifted, his stance widening. "All right, that's it." He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a non-compliant driver on Highway 94, mile marker 132. The static of the radio crackled in response. Reynolds leaned down again, his voice lower now. "Last chance. Out of the car, or you're under arrest for obstructing an officer." Maya's mind raced through her options. She could comply, knowing this was an abuse of authority. She could continue resisting, likely ending up in custody, Or she could try a third approach. "Officer," she said, her tone shifting to something more formal. "Before this continues, I think you should know that I'm Major Maya Evans, United States Air Force, currently stationed at Peterson Space Force Base. I've been driving since Colorado Springs and have not violated any traffic laws. I'd appreciate professional courtesy here." For a moment, Reynolds seemed to hesitate. Then his face hardened. "I don't care if you're the Secretary of Defense. Get out of the car. Now." With deliberate calm, Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. As she stepped onto the gravel shoulder, the cool night air hit her face. She stood tall, hands visible, her military bearing automatic even in civilian clothes. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle," Reynolds ordered. "On what grounds am I being—" Before she could finish, Reynolds grabbed her arm, spinning her roughly toward the car. "Resisting an officer," he growled, yanking her wrist behind her back. "I am not resisting," Maya stated clearly, loudly enough that it would be picked up by any recording devices. "I am complying under protest and requesting to know the charges." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists as Reynolds tightened them, far tighter than necessary. Maya winced but made no sound. "You think that uniform of yours makes you special?" Reynolds muttered, patting her down with unnecessary thoroughness. "Makes you above the law?" "No," Maya replied evenly. "It's why I respect the law, which is being violated right now." That earned her a rough shove toward the patrol car. "We'll see how smart you are at the station." As Reynolds pushed her into the back seat, Maya caught his smirk in the dome light of the cruiser. He thought this was over, that he'd won. But as the door slammed shut, Maya allowed herself a small, grim smile. Officer Reynolds had no idea what he'd just started. The cage separating the back seat from the front pressed against Maya's knees as Reynolds slid behind the wheel. The patrol car smelled of artificial pine and something sharper, less pleasant. Maya shifted, trying to find a comfortable position with her hands cuffed behind her back. Reynolds didn't speak as he pulled onto the highway, but she could feel his satisfaction radiating from the front seat. The satisfaction of a bully who thinks he's broken his target. After a few minutes of silence, he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Not so talkative now, huh?" Maya met his eyes in the reflection. "Just waiting to make my phone call, officer." Reynolds chuckled. "You watch too much TV." "And you should have checked my credentials more carefully," Maya replied. That seemed to irritate him. Reynolds' knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Listen, lady." "Major," Maya corrected. "Whatever," he snapped. "I've dealt with your type before. Military folks thinking they deserve special treatment." Maya leaned forward slightly. "Special treatment? Like basic respect and lawful procedure?" "You're right, I do expect that. For myself and everyone else." Reynolds ignored her, instead fiddling with the radio until sports commentary filled the car. Maya took the opportunity to observe her surroundings, noting road signs and landmarks. They were heading toward Billings, but taking a route that seemed unnecessarily long. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department, a modern, one-story building with far too few cars in the lot for Maya's comfort. Late-night processing meant skeleton crew, fewer witnesses. Reynolds cut the engine and came around to the door. When he pulled it open, Maya didn't move. "Out," he ordered. "I'd like to speak to the watch commander," Maya said. Reynolds grabbed her arm, yanking her from the seat. "You'll speak to whoever I tell you to speak to." Inside, the station was quiet, just a bored-looking desk sergeant who barely glanced up as Reynolds paraded Maya through. The booking area was empty except for a deputy typing at a computer. "Got a live one, Jerry," Reynolds called out, shoving Maya toward the processing desk. "Resisting, obstructing, probably impaired too." The deputy, Jerry, looked up with mild interest. "Paperwork's gonna be a bitch tonight, huh?" Reynolds grinned. "Worth it." Maya stood silently as they took her photo, her fingerprints, cataloging her like a criminal. She knew better than to argue now. This part was by the book, at least. When they finally removed the cuffs to complete the processing, she rolled her wrists, wincing at the raw skin where the metal had dug in. "Hurts?" Reynolds asked, noticing her discomfort. "Should have thought about that before you decided to be difficult." Maya said nothing. She simply held out her wrist when they finished, accepting the cuffs again without resistance. The less she engaged, the fewer opportunities Reynolds would have to add charges. They led her to a holding cell at the end of a short corridor. It was small, with a metal bench attached to the wall and a steel toilet in the corner. The door clanged shut behind her, the lock engaging with a distinct click. Reynolds lingered, watching her through the bars. Comfortable? Maya sat down on the bench, her posture straight despite her exhaustion. "I'd like to make my phone call now, please." He smirked. "It's 1 a.m. Who you gonna call, the president?" "Actually," Maya replied calmly, "I was thinking of Colonel Richard Harmon, my commanding officer. Or perhaps Senator Whitaker. She's a family friend." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Reynolds' face. He covered it quickly with a scoff, but Maya had seen it. "Get some sleep," he muttered, turning away. "You're going to need it." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Maya closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The bench was cold and uncomfortable. The cell smelled of bleach and sweat, and her shoulders ached from the awkward position the cuffs had forced them into. But none of that mattered, because Officer Reynolds had made 3 critical mistakes tonight. First, he'd arrested an Air Force intelligence officer without cause. Second, he'd failed to follow proper procedure at multiple points, all of which she'd carefully noted. And third, most importantly, he'd assumed she was alone, with no one to miss her. Maya opened her eyes and looked toward the corridor where Reynolds had disappeared. Let him think he'd won this round. Morning would bring a very different reality. The hours crawled by like dying insects, slow and painful. Maya's watch had been taken during processing, but she estimated it was around 3 a.m. The cell was quiet except for the occasional sounds from the main office. A phone ringing, a door closing, voices murmuring too low to make out the words. She had tried to rest, but the metal bench offered no comfort. Instead, she used the time to mentally document everything that had happened since Reynolds had pulled her over. Every word, every action, every procedural violation. In her head, she crafted the report she would file, precise, detailed, damning. Footsteps approached, and Maya opened her eyes to see a different officer, younger, with a name badge reading Diaz, carrying a paper cup. He stopped in front of her cell, expression neutral. "Thought you might want some water," he said, sliding the cup through the small opening in the bars. Maya stood, accepting it with a nod. "Thank you, Officer Diaz." He hesitated, glancing down the corridor before speaking again, his voice lower. "Look, I don't know what happened with Reynolds, but he's got a reputation. Just thought you should know." Before Maya could respond, he was already walking away. She took a slow sip of water, processing this new information. So Reynolds had a reputation. That suggested a pattern, which meant potential documentation, which meant evidence. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of chlorine, but she drank it anyway. Her throat was dry, and she needed to stay hydrated. As she sat back down, she heard more movement from the front of the station. Voices rising, a door slamming. Something was happening. Maya set the empty cup aside and waited, listening intently. The voices grew clearer as they moved down the corridor toward her cell. One of them unmistakably Reynolds, the other unfamiliar but authoritative. "Absolutely unacceptable," the unknown voice was saying. "Do you have any idea?" "I was following procedure," Reynolds cut in, defensive. "She was non-compliant, possibly intoxicated. Did you even run her ID?" The second voice was sharp with barely contained anger. "Because if you had, you'd have seen the flags on her file. They came into view then. Reynolds and an older man with captain's bars on his uniform. Captain Walsh, according to his nameplate. His face was set in tight lines, eyes flashing as he spotted Maya in the cell. "Unlock it," he ordered Reynolds. "Now." Reynolds hesitated. "Sir, the paperwork—" "Unlock the damn cell, Reynolds," Walsh snapped. With obvious reluctance, Reynolds pulled out his keys and opened the door. Maya remained seated, observing the power dynamic playing out before her. Walsh stepped forward. "Major Evans, I'm Captain James Walsh. On behalf of the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department, I want to extend my sincere apologies for this situation." Maya stood, meeting his gaze directly. "I appreciate that, Captain. I'd also appreciate these cuffs being removed." Walsh shot Reynolds a furious look. "You left her cuffed in the cell?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Standard procedure for—" "Take them off," Walsh ordered. "Now!" As Reynolds unlocked the handcuffs, Maya noticed his hands weren't quite steady. When the cuffs fell away, she rubbed her wrists, noting the red marks that would likely bruise. Walsh saw them too. His jaw tightened. "Major Evans, if you'll come with me, we can sort this out properly and get those wrists looked at." Maya followed him, aware of Reynolds trailing behind them like a scolded dog. In the main office area, she saw several people who hadn't been there during booking, including a woman in Air Force Blues. The woman snapped to attention when she spotted Maya. "Major Evans," she said, saluting crisply despite the early hour. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, ma'am. Colonel Harmon sent me to escort you back to base." Maya returned the salute, suddenly conscious of her rumpled civilian clothes and the night spent in a cell. "At ease, Lieutenant. Thank you for coming." Walsh led them to his office, closing the door firmly once everyone was inside. Reynolds stood awkwardly by the wall while Walsh took a seat behind his desk. "Major Evans," Walsh began, "your commanding officer contacted us approximately 1 hour ago. He was concerned when you failed to check in as scheduled." Maya nodded. Air Force intelligence officers on leave were required to check in regularly. A security measure she'd never been more grateful for than at this moment. "What I'd like to know," Walsh continued, turning his attention to Reynolds, "is why an Air Force officer with top security clearance was arrested on trumped-up charges without so much as a phone call to verify her identity." Reynolds swallowed. "The subject was non-compliant during a routine traffic stop." "The recording," Maya interrupted quietly. Both men looked at her. "Officer Reynolds' body camera and dash camera recordings," she clarified. "I'd like them secured immediately as evidence, before they mysteriously malfunction." Walsh's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Captain," Maya said. "I'm simply requesting that evidence be properly preserved." Walsh studied her for a moment, then nodded. "A reasonable request." He turned to Reynolds. "Your cameras were operational during this stop and arrest?" Reynolds' hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Yes, sir." "Good," Walsh said. "Then you won't mind submitting the footage immediately for review." The look on Reynolds' face suggested he very much did mind, but he nodded stiffly. "Now," Walsh continued, "Major Evans, you're free to go. Your personal effects are being gathered as we speak. The charges will be dropped, of course." "Of course," Maya echoed, her tone making it clear she expected nothing less. Walsh stood. "Again, my sincere apologies for this incident. I assure you it will be thoroughly investigated." He shot a pointed look at Reynolds. "Thoroughly." As they left the office, Maya noticed the activity level in the station had increased significantly despite the early hour. Word had clearly spread that someone had messed up, badly. At the front desk, she signed for her belongings, checking each item carefully before putting them away. Her military ID was last, and she held it up, looking directly at Reynolds as he stood sullenly nearby. "Next time," she said quietly, "you might want to read this more carefully." Reynolds said nothing, but the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. Maya tucked her ID away and turned to Lieutenant Rodriguez. "I believe my car is still on Highway 94? Rodriguez nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We've arranged for it to be brought to your hotel. Colonel Harmon thought you might appreciate some rest before driving back to base." "Colonel Harmon thought correctly," Maya said with a small smile. It was nearly 5 a.m., and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. As they walked toward the exit, Walsh fell into step beside her. "Major Evans," he said in a lowered voice, "off the record, how do you intend to proceed with this matter?" Maya glanced back at Reynolds, who was watching them from across the room. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away. "That depends, Captain," she replied. "Is this the first complaint against Officer Reynolds?" Walsh's silence was answer enough. "Then we both know how I'll proceed," Maya said. "The only question is whether your department will be part of the solution or part of the problem." Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, first hints of dawn breaking over the eastern horizon. Lieutenant Rodriguez led her to a waiting Air Force vehicle, opening the door for her. As Maya slid into the seat, she felt the weight of the night lift slightly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now she'd won the first round, and Officer Reynolds had no idea what was coming next. The Billings courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue Montana sky, its stone facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. 2 weeks had passed since Maya's arrest, 2 weeks of reports, depositions, and increasingly alarmed phone calls between the Sheriff's Department and the Air Force's legal team. Maya climbed the courthouse steps in her full-dress uniform, medals and insignia catching the light. Lieutenant Rodriguez walked beside her, along with Captain Eliza Chen, the Air Force JAG officer assigned to her case. Behind them came Colonel Harmon himself, who had flown in specifically for today's hearing. "How are you feeling, Major?" Colonel Harmon asked as they approached the entrance. Maya glanced at him. "Ready, sir." They passed through security and made their way to courtroom 3. The hearing wasn't scheduled to start for another 20 minutes, but Maya preferred to be early. Strategy and preparation, the cornerstones of intelligence work and courtroom proceedings alike. The courtroom was already buzzing with activity when they entered. On one side sat Captain Walsh and several officers from the Sheriff's Department. On the other, a cluster of civilians Maya didn't recognize. And in the corner, partially obscured by his lawyer, sat Officer Reynolds. He looked different today, his usual swagger replaced by a tight, defensive posture. His uniform was impeccable, but his face betrayed the strain of the past 2 weeks. When he spotted Maya, his expression hardened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Maya took her seat at the plaintiff's table, arranging her documents methodically before her. Captain Chen leaned in. "The Civilian Affairs Board arrived this morning," she whispered. "Apparently, they've been investigating Reynolds for months. Your case was the tipping point." Maya nodded, not entirely surprised. Officer Diaz's cryptic warning had suggested as much. "Any chance of settlement?" Chen shook her head. "Reynolds refused. He's still claiming he did nothing wrong." "Of course he is," Maya murmured. The courtroom doors opened again, and a middle-aged black woman in a tailored suit entered, accompanied by a younger man carrying multiple file folders. The woman surveyed the room with sharp eyes before making her way to the civilian group. "Who's that?" Maya asked. "Vanessa Washington," Chen replied, "civil rights attorney from Chicago. Word is she's representing 3 other plaintiffs with complaints against Reynolds." Before Maya could respond, the bailiff called for attention. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Eleanor Martinez presiding. Judge Martinez entered briskly, settling behind the bench with minimal ceremony. She was in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She surveyed the courtroom with an air of someone who had seen it all and had little patience for nonsense. "Be seated," she said, shuffling through the papers before her. "We're here for preliminary hearings in the matter of Evans versus Reynolds in Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department." She looked up, gaze sweeping the room. "I understand there have been some developments since this matter was filed." Captain Chen stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff wishes to amend the complaint to include additional charges based on new evidence that has come to light." Reynolds' attorney, a smooth-looking man with an expensive haircut, rose immediately. "Your Honor, the defense objects to any last-minute amendments designed to ambush my client." Judge Martinez regarded him coolly. "Mr. Hopkins, I've reviewed the proposed amendments. They're based on body camera footage that your client was required to submit 2 weeks ago, but somehow only materialized yesterday. If anyone should be concerned about ambushes, I believe it's Major Evans." Hopkins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Your Honor, there were technical difficulties." "Save it," Judge Martinez cut him off. "The amendments are allowed." She turned to Chen. "Captain, please proceed." As Chen outlined the amended charges, now including excessive force, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations, Maya watched Reynolds. His face had gone pale, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. When Chen finished, Judge Martinez turned to Reynolds' table. "Mr. Hopkins, does your client wish to maintain his not guilty plea in light of the new evidence?" Hopkins conferred briefly with Reynolds. "Yes, Your Honor. My client maintains that he acted within departmental guidelines." "Very well," Judge Martinez said, making a note. "Let's see this body camera footage for ourselves, shall we?" A screen lowered from the ceiling, and the courtroom lights dimmed slightly. Maya sat perfectly still as the footage began to play. The initial stop, Reynolds' aggressive approach, the escalating tension as Maya calmly asked for clarification. The courtroom was utterly silent as they watched Reynolds order her from the car without cause, as he tightened the handcuffs to the point of injury, as he made comments about her race and military status out of earshot of his radio. When the lights came back up, Judge Martinez's expression was thunderous. She turned to Captain Walsh. "Captain, are these actions consistent with your department's procedures?" Walsh stood, visibly uncomfortable. "No, Your Honor, they are not." "And was Officer Reynolds disciplined after this incident?" Walsh cleared his throat. "He was placed on administrative leave pending investigation." "With pay?" the judge pressed. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Martinez removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Mr. Hopkins, in light of what we've all just witnessed, does your client wish to reconsider his position?" Hopkins leaned toward Reynolds, their whispered conversation growing heated. Finally, Hopkins straightened. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to confer." "Granted," Judge Martinez said. "You have 15 minutes." As the court recessed, Maya remained seated, feeling the weight of eyes on her from all sides. Colonel Harmon leaned forward. "You've got him, Major," he said quietly. "That footage is damning." Maya nodded, but her attention was drawn to the civilian section, where Vanessa Washington was now conferring with her clients. One was an elderly man who kept touching his wrist in the same spot where Maya's still showed faint bruising. When court resumed, the tension was palpable. Reynolds looked defeated, his earlier defiance replaced by resignation. Hopkins stood. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence, my client wishes to change his plea to no contest." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Martinez nodded. "Very well. Before we discuss settlement terms, I understand Ms. Washington has a motion to present?" Vanessa Washington rose, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Yes, Your Honor. I represent 3 additional plaintiffs with nearly identical complaints against Officer Reynolds. We move to join our cases with Major Evans's as they demonstrate a clear pattern of misconduct." Reynolds's head snapped up, his face draining of color. His lawyer began to object, but Judge Martinez raised a hand to silence him. "Ms. Washington, are your clients present today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Washington gestured to the people seated behind her. The elderly man, a young Latina woman, and a middle-aged Native American man. Judge Martinez considered for a moment. "Given the similarities in the cases and the evidence of pattern and practice, I'm inclined to grant the motion. Mr. Hopkins, your objection is noted but overruled." She turned to address the entire courtroom. "In light of these developments, I'm ordering an immediate suspension of Officer Reynolds, pending a full hearing on all charges. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division for investigation into the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department's practices and supervision." Captain Walsh's shoulders sagged visibly. "Additionally," Judge Martinez continued, "I'm ordering that all of Officer Reynolds' arrests and citations from the past 5 years be reviewed by an independent panel." She fixed Reynolds with a stern gaze. "Officer Reynolds, you are to surrender your badge and service weapon to Captain Walsh immediately following this hearing." The finality in her voice left no room for argument. As the judge outlined the next steps, discovery timelines, deposition schedules, a full hearing date in 6 weeks. Maya watched Reynolds. He sat slumped in his chair, the realization sinking in that his career was effectively over. When the hearing concluded, Maya stood, gathering her materials with deliberate calm. As she turned to leave, she found herself face to face with Vanessa Washington and her clients. "Major Evans," Washington said, extending her hand. "Your courage in coming forward made it possible for my clients to finally be heard." "Thank you." Maya shook her hand. "I wish it hadn't been necessary." The elderly man stepped forward. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years I've been trying to get someone to listen about what that man did to me. 3 years of being told it was my word against his. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because of you, people finally believe me." Maya felt a tightness in her chest. It shouldn't have taken this long. "No," Washington agreed. "It shouldn't have. But change has to start somewhere." She handed Maya her card. "I'd like to talk more when you have time. What happened here today could be the beginning of something important." As they parted ways, Maya spotted Reynolds being escorted out a side door, his attorney following closely. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded courtroom. There was no smirk now, no swagger, just the hollow look of a man who had finally encountered the consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, alerted by the unusual presence of Air Force personnel and civil rights attorneys. Camera flashes popped as Maya descended the steps. "Major Evans, can you comment on today's hearing? Is it true Reynolds has other victims? Will you be pursuing further action against the department?" Colonel Harmon stepped forward, shielding Maya from the press. "Major Evans has no comment at this time. This is an ongoing legal matter." They made their way to the waiting car, the questions continuing to fly around them. As they pulled away, Maya watched the courthouse reseat in the rear window. "What happens now?" Lieutenant Rodriguez asked from the front seat. Maya turned her gaze forward. "Now, we make sure this never happens again." Because the badge that had made Reynolds feel untouchable had become the very thing that brought him down. And that was a lesson worth teaching, not just to one corrupt officer, but to an entire system that had protected him for far too long. The real work was just beginning. 1 month later, Maya stood at the podium in a conference room at Peterson Space Force Base, facing a sea of uniformed personnel. The briefing had been mandatory for all officers and senior enlisted, the kind of all-hands meeting usually reserved for major policy changes or security threats. In a way, this was both. "The incident I experienced is not unique," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "What makes it unique is the outcome." Behind her, a slide displayed statistics on racial disparities in traffic stops, arrests, and use of force, data compiled by the research team she now headed. Since the hearing, 47 additional complaints against Officer Reynolds have surfaced. 17 arrests have been overturned, 5 lawsuits have been filed, and the Department of Justice has opened a pattern or practice investigation into the entire Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department. She clicked to the next slide, a series of headlines documenting the fallout. "Sheriff resigns amid police misconduct scandal." "Independent Oversight Board established in Yellowstone County." Air Force Major's case sparks nationwide conversation on police accountability. Colonel Harmon stepped forward as Maya concluded her presentation. "What Major Evans experienced and her response to it has led to significant changes in how we prepare our personnel for civilian interactions," he said. "The new training protocols she's developed will be implemented across all Air Force bases starting next month." After the briefing, as the room cleared, General Winters, the base commander, approached Maya. "Impressive work, Major," she said. "Though I'm curious, why turn down the civilian consultant position? The DOJ offer was generous." Maya smiled slightly. "I can do more here, General. The military has its own problems with accountability and justice. If we want to create real change out there," she nodded toward the window, toward the world beyond the base, "we need to start in here." General Winters nodded thoughtfully. "Well, your promotion board meets next month. I'd say your prospects are excellent." "Thank you, ma'am," Maya replied, "but that's not why I did this." "I know," the general said. "That's exactly why you deserve it." As Maya gathered her materials, her phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa, Washington. "Case settled. Reynolds permanently barred from law enforcement. Department overhaul underway. You made this happen." Attached was a photo. Washington standing with her clients on the courthouse steps, their faces alight with the particular joy that only comes from long-delayed justice. Maya smiled at the image. This wasn't about her, not really. It was about all the people who hadn't had her advantages, her rank, her training, her resources, when facing the same abuse of power. It was about changing a system that had protected the Reynolds of the world for far too long. Her phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from an unknown number. "Thank you for telling the truth." Officer Diaz. Maya tucked her phone away, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. One corrupt officer had been stopped. One department was being reformed. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you needed to change everything. As she left the briefing room, Maya passed a group of young airmen in training, their faces eager and untested. They snapped to attention when they saw her, and she returned their salutes crisply. These were the next generation, the ones who would carry forward whatever world they inherited from their predecessors. Maya had helped make that world a little more just, a little more accountable. It wasn't why she joined the Air Force. It wasn't what she'd expected when she set out on that long drive across Montana. But it was, without question, her most important mission yet. And unlike the intelligence operations she'd run in the past, classified, buried, never to see the light of day, this was a mission whose success depended entirely on being seen, on being heard, on inspiring others to stand up when faced with injustice. Officer Reynolds had thought his badge made him untouchable. Major Maya Evans had proven him wrong, and that was a lesson worth sharing. If this story moved you, remember, power unchecked is power abused. Share this video. Start these conversations, because real change begins when we refuse to stay silent. 6 months after Officer Reynolds' downfall, a light rain fell on Washington, D.C. as Maya stood at the entrance to the Capitol building. The marble steps glistened beneath her feet, and the American flag hung heavy and wet above her head. She checked her watch. 15 minutes until her testimony. Nervous? Vanessa Washington asked, appearing beside her with 2 coffee cups. She handed one to Maya and took a sip from the other. Maya accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Not nervous, just aware of the stakes. As you should be, Vanessa said. The Police Accountability Act has been stalled in committee for 3 years. Your testimony could be what finally pushes it through. They entered the Capitol, passing through security with the special badges they'd been issued for today's hearing. The hallways bustled with staffers, lobbyists, and other witnesses, all moving with the particular urgency that defined Washington politics. Maya had traded her military uniform for a conservative Navy suit, her medals replaced by a single lapel pin bearing the Air Force insignia. This wasn't a military operation, but it felt just as critical as any mission she'd undertaken. The committee room was already filling when they arrived. Maya recognized several faces from news coverage: senators, representatives, policy experts, and in the back row, a group she hadn't expected. 3 of Reynolds' other victims, including the elderly man from the courthouse. They came to support you, Vanessa explained, following Maya's gaze. Word spread about your testimony. People have been organizing. Before Maya could respond, her phone vibrated. A text from Colonel Harmon. Watching the live stream. The entire base is behind you. Do us proud, Major. A congressional aide approached, clipboard in hand. Major Evans? You're up after Dr. Henderson. Should be about 10 minutes. Maya took a seat in the front row, reviewing her notes one last time. The prepared testimony was concise, factual, exactly what you'd expect from a military intelligence officer. But she knew the real impact would come from the unscripted moments, the questions, the human connection behind the statistics and legal jargon. Dr. Alicia Henderson, a criminologist from Georgetown, was concluding her testimony as Maya listened. The data is unambiguous, Doctor, Henderson stated. Departments with robust civilian oversight and mandatory body camera protocols show a 42% reduction in use of force incidents and a 36% decrease in civilian complaints. A senator, Michaels from Ohio, Maya recognized, leaned forward. And yet the Fraternal Order of Police continues to oppose these measures. Why do you think that is? Dr. Henderson removed her glasses. Change is difficult, Senator, particularly when it challenges existing power structures. Thank you, Dr. Henderson, the committee chair said. We'll now hear from Major Maya Evans, United States Air Force. Maya moved to the witness table, arranging her materials as she'd been trained. Efficiently, methodically, she adjusted the microphone and looked up at the semicircle of faces studying her. Major Evans, the chair began, your experience has become something of a catalyst for police reform discussions across the country. Could you share with the committee what happened that night in Montana? Maya didn't refer to her notes. She didn't need to. Every moment of that night remained etched in her memory with perfect clarity. At approximately 12:17 a.m. on April 3rd, I was pulled over by Officer Daniel Reynolds of the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department. She began, her voice steady. What should have been a routine traffic stop, if there was even cause for one, escalated into a wrongful arrest, excessive force, and a night in jail. All because I asked why I was being detained. For the next 10 minutes, Maya recounted the experience in precise detail, the unwarranted aggression, the racial undertones, the deliberate tightening of the handcuffs, the dismissal of her rights. But my story, she continued, is not unique. What makes it unique is that I had advantages many Americans don't. I had military training on how to respond to escalation. I had an organization that noticed when I didn't check in. I had resources for legal representation. She paused, meeting the gaze of each committee member in turn. Most victims of police misconduct have none of these advantages. A representative from Texas leaned forward. Major Evans, critics might say your military background made you less cooperative, perhaps even confrontational with law enforcement. How would you respond? Maya had anticipated this question. On the contrary, Congressman, my military training taught me to respect lawful authority and proper procedure. What it didn't teach me was to submit to abuse of power. Officer Reynolds wasn't following protocol that night. He was exercising personal authority, motivated by bias. The difference is critical. The questions continued, some supportive, others challenging, a few seemingly designed to provoke rather than inform. Maya met each one with the same measured confidence. Major Evans, Senator Rodriguez from California, asked, "In your opinion, what specific reforms would have prevented your experience?" "Three things, Senator," Maya replied without hesitation. First, genuine accountability. Officer Reynolds had multiple complaints in his file, yet remained on patrol. Second, mandatory body cameras with penalties for failure to activate. And third, independent oversight, not fellow officers investigating their colleagues. As the hearing concluded, the committee chair thanked Maya for her testimony. "Your perspective is valuable, Major, especially given your service to this country. We appreciate your willingness to share such a difficult experience." Maya gathered her materials, aware of the cameras tracking her movement, the reporters already crafting their headlines. As she exited the witness table, Vanessa squeezed her arm in silent approval. Outside the committee room, they were immediately surrounded by journalists. "Major Evans, the FOP has released a statement calling your testimony antithetical to public safety. Your response?" Maya faced the cameras directly. "Public safety depends on public trust. When law enforcement abuses power, that trust erodes. My testimony isn't anti-police. It's pro-accountability. Those aren't opposing values unless you're doing something wrong." The quote would be on every major news network within the hour. As they navigated through the Capitol corridors, Vanessa's phone buzzed continuously with notifications. "It's blowing up," she said, scanning the screen. "Your hashtag is trending nationally. Hold the badge accountable." Maya hadn't created the hashtag. It had emerged organically after her story first broke. Now it had become a rallying cry for police reform advocates across the country. They emerged onto the Capitol steps to find a small crowd gathered despite the rain. Activists, community organizers, and ordinary citizens holding signs with Maya's hashtag and phrases like, "Justice shouldn't depend on rank," and "Accountability is not anti-police." A young black woman stepped forward, hand extended. "Major Evans, I'm Kiana Johnson, founder of Citizens for Police Accountability. What you did today, it matters. More than you know." Maya shook her hand. "I'm just one voice." "Sometimes one voice is all it takes," Kiana replied, "especially when that voice has credibility on both sides. The right can't dismiss you as anti-authority, and the left can't ignore your first-hand experience. You're the bridge we've been waiting for." Before Maya could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Colonel Harmon again. "Excuse me," she said to Kiana, stepping aside to answer. "Colonel? Major, have you seen the news?" Harmon asked without preamble. "I just finished testifying." "Not that new," he cut in. "Reynolds. He's gone public, claiming you set him up, that the Air Force is conducting some kind of vendetta against local law enforcement. He's making the rounds on cable news." Maya's stomach tightened. "He's trying to get ahead of the narrative." "Exactly. And he's not alone. There's pushback coming from police unions nationwide. This just got bigger, Maya." She looked back at the small crowd on the steps, at Kiana and the others watching her expectantly, at the rain-slicked Capitol dome rising above them. "It was always going to get bigger, sir," she said quietly. "That's how change happens." As she ended the call, Vanessa approached, concern evident in her expression. "Problem? Reynolds is fighting back," Maya explained, "going public with counter-allegations." Vanessa's expression hardened. "Let him. The body camera footage doesn't lie, and now the whole country is watching." Maya nodded, but a weight settled in her chest. She had stepped into this fight knowing there would be resistance, but understanding something intellectually was different from experiencing it firsthand. Reynolds had lost his badge, but he still had allies, still had a voice. And now he was using it to attack her credibility, her motives, even her patriotism. "What's our next move?" Vanessa asked. Maya straightened her shoulders, decision made. "We go on offense. No more waiting for them to set the terms. It's time to take control of this narrative." Because this wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. It wasn't even about one broken department. It had become something far larger, a national conversation about power, accountability, and what justice really meant in America. And Maya Evans, who had never sought the spotlight, now stood directly in its glare. 3 days after her congressional testimony, Maya sat in the green room of the national news network, waiting to go live for her first major television interview. A makeup artist made final touches to her appearance, while a producer hovered nearby, scrolling through his tablet. "2 minutes, Major Evans," the producer announced. "You'll be on after the commercial break. Remember, direct responses, keep it conversational, and if Morgan tries to interrupt..." "She'll hold her ground," Vanessa interjected from the corner, where she'd been reviewing talking points. "Major Evans doesn't need media coaching." The producer smiled tightly. "Of course, just doing my job." When he stepped away, Maya caught Vanessa's eye in the mirror. "Nervous?" Vanessa asked. "Focused," Maya replied. "Reynolds was on the same show yesterday. I know exactly what I'm walking into." The door opened, and a young woman with a headset poked her head in. "We're ready for you, Major." The studio lights were hotter than Maya had expected, the set smaller. Madeline Morgan, the show's host, rose to greet her with a practiced smile and a firm handshake. "Major Evans, thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat." As Maya settled into the chair opposite Morgan, she took in the massive viewership counter visible on the off-camera monitor. Nearly 3 million people were watching live. Millions more would see clips online later. "And we're back with Major Maya Evans," Morgan began as the cameras went live. "Major Evans has become the center of a national debate following her arrest by Officer Daniel Reynolds and her subsequent testimony before Congress advocating for police reform. Major, welcome to the program." "Thank you for having me," Maya replied evenly. Morgan leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening. "Yesterday on this program, Officer Reynolds claimed your version of events was, quote, politically motivated and factually distorted. He suggested your military connections allowed you to pressure the department into dropping charges that were, in his view, legitimate. How do you respond?" Maya had watched Reynolds' interview, had studied it, in fact, noting every false claim, every misdirection. Now she met Morgan's gaze directly. "The body camera footage tells the truth," she said simply. "Anyone who watches it can see exactly what happened that night. Officer Reynolds escalated a routine stop without cause, used excessive force, and made comments about my race when he thought his microphone wasn't picking it up. And yet," Morgan countered, "some law enforcement advocates argue that releasing such footage publicly undermines police authority and potentially endangers officers." "I would argue," Maya responded, "that what undermines police authority is not the transparency, but the misconduct itself. Good officers, and there are many, have nothing to fear from body cameras." The interview continued in this vein for several minutes, Morgan presenting Reynolds' claims, Maya calmly dismantling them with facts. Then Morgan shifted tactics. "Let's talk about the broader implications," she said. "Your case has inspired what some are calling an anti-police movement. The hashtag associated with your case has been used in protests where officers have been injured. Do you feel any responsibility for that?" Maya didn't flinch. "Holding bad actors accountable isn't anti-police. It's pro-justice. I've never advocated for violence, and I never will. What I advocate for is a system where the badge is a symbol of public trust, not a shield from consequence." Morgan pressed on. "Officer Reynolds claims he's received death threats since your case went public. His children have been harassed at school. Even if you disagree with his actions that night, do you think that's appropriate?" "Absolutely not," Maya said firmly. "My issue is with systemic problems and individual misconduct, not with Officer Reynolds as a person." No one's family should suffer for their professional actions, and I unequivocally condemn any harassment or threats. Morgan seemed slightly taken aback by the direct answer. She glanced down at her notes, then shifted topics again. Some critics have suggested that, as a military officer, you have a vested interest in undermining civilian law enforcement, that this is about inter-service rivalry rather than genuine reform. What do you say to that? Maya allowed herself a small smile. I say that's absurd. The military and civilian law enforcement serve different functions in our society, both essential. This isn't about rivalry, it's about accountability. And if anything, my military experience has given me a deep respect for properly exercised authority and clear chains of command. Before Morgan could respond, Maya continued, What happened to me was wrong, but what's truly wrong is that it happens to people without my advantages every single day, and they don't get congressional hearings or national interviews. They don't get justice. That's what needs to change. In the control room, Vanessa watched the monitors with growing satisfaction. Maya was handling Morgan masterfully, calm, direct, impossible to fluster. The social media feeds displayed on auxiliary screens showed the audience was responding. Gaywankarn hold, the badge accountable spiking with each of Maya's responses. When the interview concluded, Morgan extended her hand again. Thank you for your candor, Major Evans. And thank you for the opportunity, Maya replied. As soon as the cameras cut, Morgan's professional demeanor softened slightly. That was not what I expected, she admitted. What did you expect? Maya asked. Morgan considered for a moment. Someone easier to rattle, I suppose. Maya smiled. I've been interrogated by experts, Ms. Morgan. This was just a conversation. Back in the green room, Vanessa was waiting with barely contained excitement. You killed it, she said, showing Maya her phone. Social media is overwhelmingly positive. Even conservative commentators are acknowledging your points about accountability versus anti-police sentiment. Maya nodded, but her attention was caught by another notification on her own phone, a text from a number she didn't recognize. You think you've won? This is just beginning. Not everyone with a badge is as easy to take down as Reynolds. Watch your back, Major. She deleted the message without mentioning it to Vanessa. Threats were to be expected. They didn't change anything. What's next? Vanessa asked as they gathered their things. Maya checked her watch. Flight to Chicago in 3 hours. Community forum tomorrow, then the police union conference the day after. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. The police union actually kept your speaking slot? I'm surprised. So are they, probably, Maya replied. But backing out now would look worse than letting me speak. Besides, if we're going to change the system, we need to engage with everyone in it, especially those who disagree with us. As they left the studio, Maya's phone buzzed again. This time it was Colonel Harmon. Outstanding job, Major, he said when she answered, but there's a situation developing you should know about. Maya listened as he explained. In the wake of her congressional testimony, a group of officers in Yellowstone County had resigned in protest. The department was now severely understaffed, and county officials were blaming her directly for a resulting rise in response times. They're calling it the Evans effect, Harmon said, claiming reform efforts are driving good officers out of the profession. Maya absorbed this silently. It was a predictable counter-strategy. Blame the reformer for the disruption, rather than addressing the underlying problems that made reform necessary. There's more, Harmon continued. We've received credible information that certain groups are planning to disrupt your upcoming appearances. Nothing specific enough to cancel, but enough to warrant additional security. I understand, Maya said. Thank you for the heads up, sir. As she ended the call, Vanessa looked at her questioningly. Complications, Maya explained briefly. Nothing we didn't anticipate. But as their car pulled away from the studio, Maya's thoughts turned to the larger battle ahead. Reynolds had been just the beginning, a single thread in a tightly woven system that resisted being unraveled. Now that system was fighting back, not just against her personally, but against the very idea of change. The problem wasn't just bad officers like Reynolds. It was the culture that protected them, the unions that defended them regardless of conduct, the politicians who feared challenging them, and the public that had been conditioned to accept the status quo. Maya glanced at her phone, at the deleted threat message, at the news alerts about the Evans effect. She had known this wouldn't be easy. What surprised her wasn't the resistance. It was her own resolve in the face of it. 6 months ago, she had been an intelligence officer focused on international threats. Now she found herself on the front lines of a different kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with words, policy, and public opinion. It wasn't the mission she had trained for, but it was undoubtedly the mission she had been given. The Chicago Police Union Conference occupied the entire third floor of the Lakeside Hotel, its corridors filled with officers in various uniforms from departments across the Midwest. As Maya made her way to the main ballroom, she felt the weight of their stares, some curious, others openly hostile. Her security detail, 2 Air Force OSI agents assigned by Colonel Harmon, flanked her closely, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd. After the threats and the warning about potential disruptions, no one was taking chances. "Still think this is a good idea?" Agent Ramirez murmured as they approached the ballroom doors. Maya's expression remained neutral. Good ideas aren't always comfortable ones. Inside, the ballroom was set up theater-style, with perhaps 500 seats facing a raised stage. Maya noted that while the front rows were filled, the back half of the room remained conspicuously empty, a silent protest against her presence. The conference organizer, a heavyset man named Griggs, met them at a side entrance. His handshake was perfunctory, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Major Evans, we've allocated 20 minutes for your presentation, followed by 10 minutes of moderated questions." "Moderated by whom?" Maya asked. "Myself," Griggs replied, given the sensitivity of the topic. Maya nodded. "I understand, and I appreciate the invitation standing despite the controversy." Griggs's expression tightened. "The union believes in open dialogue, even with those whose views we may not share." He led them to a small waiting area adjacent to the stage. Through a monitor, Maya could see the current speaker wrapping up his presentation on tactical response protocols. The audience appeared engaged, applauding at appropriate moments. "You're up next," Griggs said. "I should warn you, this crowd isn't going to be as receptive as your congressional committee." "I'm not here for applause," Maya replied evenly. Griggs studied her for a moment, then nodded and left them alone. Agent Ramirez checked his watch. "We have movement at the main entrance," he said quietly into his comm device. After a moment, he frowned. "A group just arrived. Around 20 individuals in matching t-shirts. Appears to be organized." "Protesters?" Maya asked. "Unclear. Security is checking them now." Before they could discuss it further, the monitor showed the current speaker concluding to polite applause. Griggs stepped onto the stage, adjusting the microphone. "Our next speaker has become something of a controversial figure in law enforcement circles," he began. "However, the Union Executive Committee felt it important to hear directly from those advocating for reform, rather than simply responding to media narratives." The introduction was as lukewarm as Maya had expected. She straightened her blazer and prepared to take the stage. "Please welcome United States Air Force Major Maya Evans." The applause was sparse, scattered throughout the front rows. From the back of the room came a different sound, a low murmur that grew as Maya walked to the podium. She placed her notes before her, took a measured breath, and looked out at the sea of largely skeptical faces. "Thank you for having me today," she began. "I recognize that my presence here is uncomfortable for many of you. That's understandable. Change is always uncomfortable, especially when it feels imposed from outside." The murmuring quieted slightly as the officers waited to see where she would go with this. "I'm not here to vilify police," Maya continued. "I'm not here to tell you that your jobs aren't difficult, dangerous, and essential. They are all of those things. What I am here to say is that difficulty doesn't exempt any profession from accountability." She paused, noting the subtle shift in body language among the front rows, arms uncrossing, heads tilting slightly. "The military taught me that authority comes with responsibility, that leaders are accountable not just for their own actions, but for the culture they create, that no one, regardless of rank or role, is above the standards we set together." As Maya moved deeper into her presentation, using data rather than emotion to make her points about reform, the mood in the room began to shift, not to agreement, certainly, but to something approaching genuine consideration. She wasn't what they had expected, not an angry activist, not a political opportunist, but a fellow public servant speaking their language of duty and standards. Body cameras protect good officers as much as they constrain bad ones, she pointed out. Independent review boards validate legitimate uses of force as much as they penalize excessive ones. These aren't anti-police measures. They're pro-accountability measures. And accountability serves everyone's interests, especially yours. Just as Maya was hitting her stride, a commotion erupted at the back of the ballroom. The group Ramirez had noted earlier stood as one, revealing t-shirts bearing Reynolds' face and the slogan, "Stand with Daniel." "Liar," a voice shouted. "She's trying to destroy us." Maya paused, watching as Griggs hurried from his seat at the side of the stage, signaling to security. The disruption was coordinated but contained, more theatrical than threatening. Then a new figure appeared in the center aisle, a face Maya recognized instantly from courtroom confrontations and television interviews. Daniel Reynolds himself. He wore civilian clothes, his former uniform and badge gone, but he carried himself with the same swagger, the same certainty of his rightness. Behind him, his supporters grew louder, drowning out Griggs's attempts to restore order. Maya felt Agent Ramirez tense beside her, ready to move if necessary, but she raised a hand slightly, signaling him to wait. This confrontation had been inevitable. Better here in a controlled environment than elsewhere. As Reynolds approached the stage, security personnel moved to intercept him, but Maya spoke into the microphone, her voice cutting through the noise. "Let him speak." The room fell silent, all eyes moving between Maya and Reynolds. Security hesitated, looking to Griggs, who reluctantly nodded his approval. Reynolds climbed the steps to the stage, stopping a few feet from Maya. Up close, she could see the toll the past months had taken on him. The strain around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. He had lost weight, lost his swagger, lost the certainty that had defined him during their first encounter. But anger still burned in his eyes. "You destroyed my life," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. 20 years on the force. A clean record. 17 complaints is not a clean record, Maya interrupted calmly. It's just a record without consequences. Reynolds' face flushed. "You don't know what it's like out there. The decisions we have to make in split seconds. The dangers we face every day." "You're right," Maya acknowledged. "I don't know what it's like to be a police officer. Just like you don't know what it's like to be pulled over for no reason, handcuffed too tightly, and thrown in a cell because you asked a question." They stood facing each other, the embodiment of America's divided perspectives on policing, separated not just by experience, but by fundamentally different understandings of what authority meant and how it should be wielded. "Everything I did that night was by the book," Reynolds insisted, though his voice lacked the certainty it once held. "Then the book needs to be rewritten," Maya replied simply. A murmur went through the audience. Not agreement, not disagreement, but something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, that this confrontation represented something larger than two individuals. "My kids can't go to school without being harassed," Reynolds continued, his voice breaking slightly. "My wife lost her job. My house is in foreclosure. All because you couldn't just cooperate for 5 minutes." For the first time, Maya saw beyond Reynolds the officer to Reynolds the man, flawed, frightened, facing the consequences of actions he still couldn't quite acknowledge were wrong. "I'm sorry about your family," she said, and meant it. "They don't deserve that. No one should be punished for someone else's actions." Reynolds seemed taken aback by the genuine sympathy. He had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even fear. Instead, he got compassion, which somehow felt worse. "But," Maya continued, "what happened to me that night wasn't about cooperation. It was about power. You wanted compliance, not because it was necessary, but because you expected it. And when you didn't get it, you escalated. Not because I was a threat, but because I challenged your authority." The room was utterly silent now, hundreds of officers watching this unexpected reckoning play out in real time. "I didn't set out to destroy your career," Maya said. "I set out to hold you accountable. There's a difference." Reynolds stared at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried in the silence. "You think this changes anything? You think cops are suddenly going to stop doing what needs to be done because of you? Because of cameras? Because of oversight?" He shook his head. You have no idea how the real world works. Maya met his gaze steadily. Change doesn't happen in a moment, Mr. Reynolds. It happens in thousands of moments, in thousands of decisions. It happens when good officers speak up about bad ones, when departments embrace accountability instead of fearing it, when the public demands better and refuses to accept less. She gestured to the room around them. It happens in rooms like this, in conversations exactly like this one. For a brief moment, something shifted in Reynolds' expression, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even understanding. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar hardness. He turned away without another word, walking off the stage and down the center aisle as his supporters closed around him. The doors closed behind them with a heavy thud that echoed through the ballroom. Griggs approached the microphone, clearly unsure how to proceed after such a dramatic interruption. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. An officer in the third row stood up. "I have a question," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "A real one, not a gotcha." Maya nodded for him to continue. "You talk about accountability," the officer said, "but who holds the community accountable? Who holds the media accountable when they run with half-truths? Who holds politicians accountable when they throw us under the bus for votes?" It was a fair question, one Maya had anticipated. "Everyone should be accountable," she acknowledged. "Communities for supporting lawful enforcement, media for responsible reporting, politicians for consistent policy rather than convenient outrage. But none of that diminishes the specific accountability that comes with a badge and a gun, with the power to detain, to arrest, even to take life." Another officer stood. "What about resources? You want better training, better screening, body cameras, review boards, all while many departments are already underfunded?" Maya nodded. "Which is why reform has to include funding priorities. Military-grade equipment versus de-escalation training. Warrior mentality versus guardian approach. These aren't just philosophical choices, they're budgetary ones." More questions followed, some challenging, others genuinely curious, each more substantive than Maya had dared hope for. What had begun as a confrontation had somehow transformed into something approaching dialogue. By the time Griggs finally called an end to the session, well past the allocated time, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Not to agreement, but to engagement, to the acknowledgement that perhaps this conversation wasn't as black and white as either side had assumed. As Maya gathered her notes, a senior officer approached the stage. His nameplate identified him as Chief Wilson from a department in southern Illinois. "That was not what I expected," he admitted, "especially after that business with Reynolds." "What did you expect?" Maya asked. Wilson considered the question. "A lecture, accusations, more heat than light." He paused. "Instead, we got a conversation worth having, even if we don't agree on all the answers." He extended his hand. "My department is implementing some changes next month. Body cameras, civilian review. If you're interested in consulting on the implementation, we could use someone with your perspective." Maya shook his hand, surprised but encouraged. "I'd be happy to discuss it." As they left the ballroom, Agent Ramirez scanned the corridor before allowing Maya to proceed. "That could have gone very differently," he observed. "It still might," Maya replied, realistic about the road ahead. One conversation doesn't change a system. But as they made their way through the hotel, Maya noticed something unexpected. Officers nodding to her as she passed. Some even approaching to continue discussions begun during the Q&A. Not agreement, not endorsement, but engagement. Recognition. Respect. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even close to the systemic change needed. But it was a beginning. The kind that started not with dramatic confrontation, but with difficult, honest conversation. And in the battle for accountability, those conversations might ultimately prove more powerful than any protest, any policy, any hashtag. Because real change didn't come from destroying the old guard, as Reynolds had accused her of doing. It came from transforming it. One mind, one department, one interaction at a time. As they reached the hotel lobby, Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. CNN reporting Reynolds just announced book deal and Fox News contributor role. "The fight continues." Maya smiled slightly. "Of course it did. Change was never easy, never linear, never complete. But for the first time since that night on a Montana highway, she felt certain they were moving in the right direction. 1 year to the day after her arrest, Maya stood at the back of a training room at the newly established National Center for Police Accountability and Reform in Denver. Before her, 30 law enforcement executives from departments across the country listened as Vanessa Washington outlined the legal implications of various oversight models. The center had been Maya's idea, but it had taken the combined efforts of civil rights organizations, forward-thinking police leaders, and surprisingly bipartisan political support to make it reality. Housed in a renovated warehouse, it served as both training facility and think tank, a place where best practices could be developed, tested, and shared. Maya's phone vibrated silently in her pocket. A text from Colonel Harmon. "Promotion board results are in. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Evans. Effective immediately." She smiled, tucking the phone away without responding. The promotion was gratifying, but it wasn't what drove her anymore. In fact, she had already submitted paperwork for an extended assignment to the center, temporarily stepping away from traditional military duties to focus on this work. "Major Evans?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Chief Wilson, the same Illinois police chief who had approached her after the union conference confrontation. "Sorry, I guess it's Lieutenant Colonel now?" News travels fast. "Maya is fine," she replied, shaking his hand. "How's the implementation going?" Wilson's department had been one of the first to adopt the center's comprehensive reform package. Body cameras, civilian oversight, revised use of force policies, and expanded de-escalation training. 6 months in, complaints are down 38%, he reported. Officer morale was rocky at first, but it's stabilizing. The cameras have actually exonerated officers in 3 incidents where initial witness accounts were inaccurate. Maya nodded. That's exactly how it should work. Accountability protects everyone. Not everyone sees it that way, Wilson admitted. Reynolds has been making the rounds again, pushing back on the Police Accountability Act. His book is selling well. The act, born from Maya's congressional testimony, had passed the House but remained stalled in the Senate. Reynolds had indeed found a second career as a vocal critic of reform, positioning himself as a martyr to political correctness and anti-police sentiment. "Let him talk," Maya said. "The data speaks louder." As the training session broke for lunch, Maya made her way to her office at the back of the building. The space was spare but functional. A desk, a whiteboard covered in flowcharts, and a wall of photographs documenting the center's progress. Among them was a news photo from 6 months ago. Maya standing with Kiana Johnson and the families of 3 individuals who had died in police custody. The case files had been reopened following new department policies inspired by the center's work. 2 had resulted in officers being charged. The 3rd remained under investigation. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Vanessa entered, followed by a young black man Maya didn't recognize. "Sorry to interrupt," Vanessa said, "but there's someone you should meet." She gestured to the man. "This is Jamal Taylor. He was arrested by Officer Reynolds 4 years ago. Case very similar to yours, but with a very different outcome." Jamal's expression was guarded, his posture tense. "Ms. Washington says you might be able to help," he said, his voice low. "I spent 2 years in prison because of Reynolds. Lost my job, my apartment. My kids grew up visiting me behind glass." Maya gestured for Jamal to take a seat. As he settled into the chair, she noted the careful way he held himself, the hyper-awareness of someone who had learned to move through the world expecting danger at every turn. "Tell me what happened," she said. Jamal's story poured out in measured tones, a traffic stop much like Maya's, but with escalation that went far beyond handcuffs. Reynolds had claimed to smell marijuana, used that as pretext to search the car, then found drugs that Jamal insisted weren't his. With a prior misdemeanor on his record, he'd face serious charges. "Public defender told me to take the plea," Jamal explained. "Said with Reynolds' testimony, I'd get 10 years if I fought it, so I took 2. His jaw tightened. Found out later Reynolds had done the same thing to at least 7 other guys. Same stretch of road, same story, same evidence. Maya exchanged glances with Vanessa, who nodded slightly. "We're working to get Jamal's conviction overturned," Vanessa explained. The new DA is reviewing all of Reynolds' drug arrests, but the process is slow. Meanwhile, Jamal can't get hired with a felony record. Even though Reynolds was fired for misconduct, Jamal added bitterly, even though everybody knows now what he was doing. Maya leaned forward. Mr. Taylor, I can't undo what happened to you, but what I can do is make sure your story is heard by the people who need to hear it. Like who? Jamal asked skeptically. Like the Senate Judiciary Committee, Maya replied. They're holding hearings on the Accountability Act next month. Your testimony could be the difference between passage and another year of delay. Jamal looked uncertain. I'm not good at public speaking. And who's going to listen to an ex-con? They listen to me, Maya pointed out. And with all due respect, your story is more important than mine. I spent one night in a cell. You lost 2 years of your life. After Jamal left with Vanessa to discuss the details, Maya stood at her office window, watching the training session resume in the main room. Chief Wilson was now at the front, sharing his department's experience with the reforms. Her phone buzzed again, this time an email notification. The subject line made her pulse quicken. Senate Judiciary Committee, hearing scheduled. She opened it immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Evans, the committee has scheduled hearings on S-1421, Police Accountability Act, for March 15th to 17th. Your testimony is requested for the opening session. Please be advised that former Officer Daniel Reynolds has also been invited to testify in opposition to the act. Senator Rodriguez's office will be in touch regarding logistics. Regards, Committee Staff. Maya read the email twice, absorbing its implications. After months of delays and procedural obstacles, the act was finally getting its hearing. But Reynolds would be there too. The confrontation at the police conference played out again, this time with national policy hanging in the balance. She closed the email and returned to the training room. As she listened to Chief Wilson describe the positive changes in his department, she found herself thinking not about Reynolds or the upcoming hearing, but about Jamal Taylor, about the 7 other men who had faced similar false charges, about the countless others whose stories would never make headlines or congressional testimony. This work wasn't about her anymore, if it ever truly had been. It was about building a system where power came with proportionate accountability, where a badge was a symbol of responsibility, not immunity, where justice didn't depend on rank or resources or luck. The Senate hearing would be another battle in that longer war. Reynolds would have his supporters, his media platform, his practiced narrative of victimhood. But Maya would have something more powerful, the truth, backed by data, embodied in stories like Jamal's. As the training session concluded, Chief Wilson approached her again. Just heard about the Senate hearing, he said. Word travels fast in these circles. You ready for another round with Reynolds? Maya smiled slightly. It was never about Reynolds, she replied. He was just the symptom. The system is the disease. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. Well, for what it's worth, you've got allies now. Not just activists, but police leaders who understand that real reform protects good officers as much as it constrains bad ones. He handed her a folder. My department's 6-month data might be useful for your testimony. As Wilson walked away, Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Harmon. Just heard about the hearing. The Air Force has your back. Do what needs to be done. Maya tucked the phone away, her resolve hardening, because what needed to be done wasn't just about winning a policy debate or outmaneuvering Reynolds. It was about creating a future where what happened to her and what happened to Jamal Taylor became increasingly rare, where accountability wasn't exceptional but expected. That future was worth fighting for, no matter how many battles it took to get there. 3 weeks later, Maya stood at the podium in the Senate hearing room, facing the Judiciary Committee. Behind her, the gallery was packed with journalists, advocates, law enforcement representatives, and families of those affected by police misconduct. Reynolds had testified earlier, his polished narrative about handcuffing police and emboldening criminals playing well to certain committee members. But now it was Maya's turn, with Jamal Taylor scheduled to follow her. Senators, she began, her voice steady. 1 year ago, I was wrongfully arrested by an officer who thought his badge made him untouchable. Today, I'm not here to tell you about my experience. You've heard that story. I'm here to tell you about what happened after, about what happens when we begin holding power accountable. She presented the data from departments that had adopted reforms, decreased complaints, increased community trust, improved officer morale, and no corresponding rise in crime rates. She shared Chief Wilson's report, highlighting how body cameras had protected officers from false accusations as often as they had documented misconduct. This act isn't anti-police, she emphasized. It's pro-accountability. And accountability serves everyone, officers, departments, and communities alike. When the questioning began, Maya met each challenge with the same measured confidence she'd shown at the police conference. To claims about costs, she pointed out the millions departments spend annually on misconduct settlements. To concerns about officer recruitment, she noted improved retention rates in reform departments. Then came the moment she'd been waiting for. Senator Carter, a longtime opponent of police reform, leaned into his microphone. Lieutenant Colonel Evans, Officer Reynolds testified that you've become, quote, a professional anti-police activist who has, quote, never faced the real dangers officers confront daily. How do you respond? Maya met his gaze directly. With respect, Senator, I've served in 3 combat deployments. I've faced danger. The difference is that when military personnel use excessive force or violate protocols, they face consequences. Accountability doesn't make us less effective. It makes us more professional. A murmur ran through the gallery. Carter's expression tightened, but he had no follow-up. As Maya concluded her testimony, she glanced toward the back of the room where Jamal Taylor waited for his turn. He gave her a slight nod, acknowledgement, respect, solidarity, because this wasn't her fight alone anymore. It had grown beyond one officer, one arrest, one department. It had become a movement, not against police, but for justice, not for revenge, but for reform. And as Maya took her seat, watching Jamal Taylor approach the podium with his head held high, she knew that whatever the outcome of this particular battle, the larger war would continue. Progress would come, not all at once, not without resistance, but inevitably. Because when power faced genuine accountability, the world changed. Not overnight, but over time. Not without struggle, but with purpose. Not through destruction, but through transformation. And that transformation had begun the moment Officer Reynolds made the mistake of pulling over the wrong woman. A woman who refused to stay silent, who turned her individual injustice into a catalyst for collective change. Maya Evans had never sought to be a symbol or a leader. She had simply sought justice, first for herself, then for others. But in doing so, she had become something more powerful than either. She had become a voice for accountability in a system that desperately needed it. And that voice, once raised, could never be silenced again. If this story moved you, remember, the world changes when people who have every advantage to stay silent choose to speak. Share this video. Join the conversation. Because real change begins when we refuse to accept injustice, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.